Chapter 1. Two Desperate Souls. One cold evening in October of 1815, a man with a long beard and dirty clothes walked into the French town of Digne. The man was in his 40s and very strong. He carried a bag and a walking staff. The man entered an inn and said to the innkeeper, "I've been traveling for a long time, and I'm very tired. I need a meal and a place to sleep. I have money to pay you." The innkeeper looked closely at the strange man.
"I know who you are. You are Jean Valjean. You've just been released from prison. I don't serve people like you. Get out of here immediately."
Jean Valjean left peacefully. Outside it was dark, cold, and windy. He was desperate for a place to rest. He lay down on a stone bench in front of a church and tried to sleep. But a woman came out and asked,
"How can you sleep outside on that stone bench?"
"I've been sleeping on a wooden one in prison for 19 years. What's the difference?" The woman pointed to a small house next to the church.
"You could stay there,"
she said. The Bishop of Digne was a gentle old man who lived with his sister and a servant. He helped anyone who was in need, and he never locked his doors. That evening he was sitting by the fire when his sister said,
"Brother, people are saying there's a terrible man in town. The police have told everyone to lock their doors and windows."
But the bishop only smiled. Suddenly there was a loud knock at the door.
"Come in,"
said the bishop. The bishop's sister and servant trembled when Jean Valjean walked into their house, but the bishop was calm. "I am Jean Valjean," said the stranger. "I've just been released from prison after 19 years. I've been walking for 4 days, and I desperately need a place to rest. Can you help me?" The bishop told his servant to set another place at the table for Valjean.
"Sit down and warm yourself, Monsieur Valjean,"
said the bishop.
"Dinner will be ready soon."
After the big meal, Valjean began to relax and look around the small house. The bishop's house was not luxurious, but he could see the valuable set of silver knives, forks, and candlesticks at the table. Then he noticed the bishop's servant putting the silverware away in a cabinet. The bishop handed one of the candlesticks to Valjean.
"Here, this will light your way. Follow me to the spare bedroom,"
said the bishop. Once they were in the room, the bishop said,
"Good night, and don't forget to have a bowl of our fresh cow's milk before you leave tomorrow."
Valjean was so tired that he fell asleep with his clothes on. But even though he was exhausted, he woke up only a few hours later. Unable to sleep, he brooded about his past. Life had been terribly unfair to him, and he was still furious about it. In 1795, Valjean had lost his job as a lumberjack. But at that time, he had been supporting his widowed sister and her 7 children. He was caught stealing loaves of bread to feed them, and had lost the best years of his life for that. Valjean wanted revenge on the whole world. Then he thought of the bishop's valuable silverware and thought of a plan. Valjean got out of bed and moved quietly around the house with his shoes off. In his hand he held a short iron bar that was sharp on one end. He went into the bishop's room and held the bar over the sleeping man's head. But the bishop's sleeping face looked so peaceful and kind that Valjean could not kill him. So he stuffed the valuable silver knives and forks into his bag and escaped by climbing through the garden in back of the house. The next morning, the bishop was sadly examining some flowers in the garden that had been damaged during Valjean's escape.
"Oh, Bishop,"
cried his servant.
"do you know that your precious silverware has been stolen? That man who stayed here last night must have taken it."
"Yes, I know,"
said the bishop.
but I think it was wrong of me to keep that expensive silverware for so long.
Later that morning, 4 policemen and Valjean came back to the bishop's house. "Bishop," said the police sergeant, "we caught this criminal with some valuable silverware. Is it yours?" The bishop smiled at Valjean.
Dear friend, you forgot to take these silver candlesticks. They will bring you at least 200 francs.
Valjean and the policeman's eyes widened in disbelief. "Sir, are you saying that you gave this silverware to this man?" asked the sergeant.
Yes, absolutely. You must let him go.
Then the policeman left. The bishop walked up close to Valjean and said,
Now, you must use this money to make yourself an honest man. I've bought your soul from the devil and given it to God.
Jean Valjean wandered into the countryside feeling confused. When the world had been unfair to him and he had been very angry, things had made sense to him. But now that he had been shown such great kindness, he didn't know what to do. Then, as he crossed a large field, Valjean encountered a 10-year-old boy. The boy was walking, whistling, and happily tossing a silver coin into the air and catching it. Valjean held out his hand and caught the boy's coin.
Please, sir, give me my coin back. I'm just a chimney sweep, and it's all the money I have.
"Go away," said Valjean.
But, monsieur, please!
Cried the boy. Valjean raised his stick to strike the boy. The boy became very frightened and ran away. Once the boy was out of sight, Valjean looked at the coin in his hand. He could not believe what he had done. He called for the boy to come back, but the boy was gone. He sat down exhausted on a rock, and for the first time in 19 years, he wept. In the year 1818, in a small village named Montfermeil, near Paris, 2 small girls were playing on a swing. It was a lovely spring evening. Their mother was a plain-looking woman with red hair. She sat nearby watching them from in front of the small inn where they lived. Suddenly, a young woman approached her and said,
Madame, your girls are very pretty.
The young woman was holding a sleeping child in her arms, but she looked poor and unhappy.
Thank you.
Said the girl's mother.
Sit down and take a rest. You look tired.
The young woman sat down and introduced herself. Her name was Fantine.
My name is Madame Thénardier,
said the woman with 2 daughters.
My husband and I manage this inn.
Fantine told the woman that she used to work in Paris, but her husband died, and she lost her job. But she was lying. In truth, she had gotten pregnant by a young man who ran away. It was very hard for unmarried women with children at this time. Then Fantine's little girl woke up. Her eyes were big and blue like her mother's. The little girl giggled and jumped off her mother's lap. She ran to play with the 2 girls on the swing.
What's your daughter's name?
Asked Madame Thénardier.
Her name is Cosette. She's nearly 3.
The 2 women watched their children playing together. Madame Thénardier laughed.
Look at how easily they play. They could be sisters.
These words made Fantine do something very strange. Suddenly, she grasped the other woman's hand and asked,
Could you possibly take care of her for me? I must find work, and it's almost impossible for a woman with a child and no husband. I'll get her as soon as I have a job. I have enough money to pay you 6 francs per month.
Madame Thénardier did not answer. She did not know what to say, but her husband was standing behind them.
We'll take care of her for 7 francs a month if you pay 6 months in advance.
Fantine took the money from her purse. The next morning, Fantine said goodbye to her daughter, kissing her and crying as if her heart were breaking.
"We need this money,"
said Monsieur Thénardier to his wife.
"Now I can pay my debts and avoid going to prison. You did a good job tricking that lady."
Although I hadn't intended to,
replied his wife. A month later, Monsieur Thénardier needed more money, so he sold Cosette's clothes for 60 francs. They dressed the little girl in rags and made her eat scraps of food under the table with the dog and the cat. In the meantime, Fantine began working at a factory in a city far away. She sent letters and money for her daughter every month. The Thénardiers began to ask for more money, and Fantine gladly paid it. They told Fantine they treated her daughter well, but in truth, while they treated their own daughters, Éponine and Azelma, very well, they treated little Cosette like a slave. Fantine was careful to keep her daughter a secret at the factory where she worked. But the women there finally discovered that she was an unwed mother and told everyone. Fantine was fired from her job and couldn't find another one anywhere. That winter, Fantine went without a fire in her little room, just to save a little more money for Cosette. She earned a little money sewing shirts, but it wasn't enough. She went to a wig maker and sold her hair for 10 francs. Then she got a letter from the Thénardiers saying that Cosette was very ill and needed 40 francs for medicine. This made Fantine very desperate. She sold her 2 front teeth. After her hair and teeth were gone, Fantine had few ways of making money, but the Thénardiers kept demanding more money. So Fantine began to sell the only thing she had left, her body. Chapter 2. The Guardian. On a cold winter night, a poor-looking woman with no teeth was arrested for attacking a man on the street. At the police station, Inspector Javert decided to send her to prison for 6 months.
Please don't send me to prison.
Cried the woman.
If I don't pay the money I owe, my daughter will lose her home and have to live in the streets.
Inspector Javert ignored her and told his men to take her away. But suddenly a voice said, "Wait, just a moment, please. I saw what happened in the street. It was the man's fault, not this woman's." Javert looked up to see Mayor Madeleine, the most important man in town. Before he was the town's mayor, Monsieur Madeleine had arrived suddenly on a winter evening in 1815. He had been penniless, but knew of a new method for making glass at a very low cost. Within a few months, his new glass-making factory made him a rich man. With that money, he built 2 new factories and brought hundreds of jobs to the town. He lived a simple life and spent most of his money building hospitals and schools. In 1820, the townspeople elected him mayor of the town. But one man in town did not like Mayor Madeleine. Inspector Javert was always suspicious of the man who had been a stranger. He felt he had seen the mayor's face before, as if he had been a dangerous criminal at an earlier time. Now the mayor was in Javert's police station, trying to save Fantine from going to prison. But when Fantine saw the mayor, she spat at him.
You owned the factory where I lost my job. Now I've become a bad woman, and I'll never get my daughter back.
Javert and the mayor argued, but Fantine was finally released. Then Mayor Madeleine said to her, "I didn't mean to cause all of these troubles for you. I'm going to help you. I'm going to pay your debts and get your daughter back to you. In God's eyes, you are not a bad woman." Fantine wept at the kindness the mayor was showing her. She knelt down and kissed his hand. The mayor sent the Thénardiers 300 francs and told them to send Cosette to him right away. But Monsieur Thénardier wrote back demanding 500 francs. Mayor Madeleine sent the money, but the Thénardiers still didn't send Cosette. Even though Fantine was close to being happy again, the years of misery and poverty had left her very weak. She became very sick and couldn't get out of bed. Whenever Mère Madeleine visited her, all she asked was,
When can I see my Cosette?
"Soon," he said, to which she would smile with joy. One morning, Mère Madeleine was preparing to travel to the Thénardiers' town himself and pick Cosette up. But Inspector Javert suddenly came into his office. "I want to apologize for being suspicious of you," said the inspector. "What are you talking about?" asked Mère Madeleine. "For years I've suspected you of being the escaped criminal Jean Valjean. But now the police in another town have caught the real Jean Valjean. The man says his name is Champmathieu, but there are several witnesses who swear he is Jean Valjean. He will face trial tomorrow and go to prison for life. I am sorry for doubting you." The inspector left, and Mère Madeleine cancelled his trip to visit the Thénardiers for the following day. That night he lay awake in bed. Mère Madeleine was in fact Jean Valjean. He could not let the man Champmathieu spend the rest of his life in prison for his crimes. He would have to go to the man's trial and admit the truth. He would lose everything he had worked for, but he had no choice. The truth was the most important thing. The next morning, Mère Madeleine traveled to the town where the trial was taking place. When he arrived, he saw that Champmathieu was a large man-child who was not intelligent enough to defend himself. Just when the judge was about to convict Champmathieu of being Jean Valjean, Mère Madeleine stood up and said, "This man is not Jean Valjean. I am." Gasps were heard around the courtroom. No one believed him at first, but he told them information that only Jean Valjean could have known. "I must leave now," said Mère Madeleine. "I have some business I must do, but I'll not try to escape when my business is finished." They let him leave the courtroom, and the judge allowed Champmathieu to go free. The next day, Mère Madeleine visited Fantine. When she saw him, she asked for Cosette. "Not now. You're too weak to see her. You must get well first," he said. Then Inspector Javert entered the room. Fantine thought the inspector was there to arrest her and became afraid. But Mère Madeleine said, "He's not here for you." Then to Inspector Javert he said, "Just give me 3 days to go and get her child, and then you can take me to prison." "I'm not going to give you 3 days to escape," said Inspector Javert.
But my child!
Cried Fantine. "Shut up, you dirty whore!" shouted Inspector Javert. "This man is not Mère Madeleine, and he's never going to bring your daughter to you. He's a dangerous criminal named Jean Valjean, and he's going to prison." Fantine fell back on her pillow and lay totally still. Jean Valjean ran to her bedside. She was dead. "Your words have killed her!" he yelled at Inspector Javert. "Come to the police station with me now, or I'll call my men to arrest you by force," said Javert. Jean Valjean kissed Fantine's head and said to the inspector, "I'm ready to go now." 2 days after being arrested, Jean Valjean escaped from prison. He managed to break the bars over his window and disappeared into the night. On Christmas in 1823, business at the Thénardiers Inn was very good. The guests ate and drank noisily while Cosette, now 8 years old, sat in her normal place under the kitchen table. She was dressed in rags, knitting wool stockings for the Thénardiers' 2 daughters. One night, Madame Thénardier ordered Cosette to go out in the cold to get a bucket of water. As she left, Madame Thénardier gave her a coin and told her to get some bread, too. Cosette walked through the dark woods to the stream. As she filled her large wooden bucket, she didn't notice the coin Madame Thénardier had given her fall through a hole in her pocket and into the frigid water. Then she began to lug the heavy bucket full of water through the woods and up the hill to the inn. The bucket was so heavy that she had to stop every few steps for some rest. Suddenly, a huge hand reached down from the sky and picked up the water bucket. Cosette looked up to see an enormous old man standing there. "What a heavy bucket this must be for a child as small as you," the man said while looking at her through gentle eyes. Cosette was not afraid of the man. She trusted his eyes. They walked back through the village together. As they walked, she told him everything about her life with the Thénardiers. As they neared the inn, he gave her the bucket and they entered the inn together.
Why were you gone so long?
Madame Thénardier asked angrily.
I met this man who needs a room for the night.
Cosette said in fear of the beating she expected. Madame Thénardier seated the old man with a glass of wine and then asked Cosette,
Where's the bread I told you to buy?
I forgot to get it, madame.
Then where's the money I gave you?
Cosette searched her pocket, but the coin was not there. She went pale. Then suddenly the old man held up a coin. "Madam, I've just found this on the floor. It must have fallen from the child's pocket." Madame Thénardier took the coin and walked away. The next morning, the old man spoke to the Thénardiers. "It seems like you don't have enough money to take care of this child very well. Why don't you let me take her?"
We love her very much.
said Monsieur Thénardier.
We couldn't let you have her for less than 1,500 francs.
The old man quickly handed him 3 500-franc notes and said, "Now fetch Cosette." The man gave her some fine new clothes and they left hand in hand for Paris. Cosette didn't know who the man was, but she had a comforting feeling that God was guarding her through this man. The man was Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean took Cosette to a large old building on the outskirts of Paris. Cosette was asleep in his arms. He took her up to the room he had rented since his escape from Inspector Javert. The days began to pass in great happiness for Cosette and Valjean. For him it was the first time in 25 years that he was not alone in the world. His heart had discovered love. One evening, Valjean heard someone on the stairs outside his room. He ran to the keyhole and saw the back of a familiar coat walking down the stairs. "Javert," he said to himself. The next day he prepared to leave their room for a safer place. That night, as they walked along the narrow streets under the light of the full moon, Valjean realized 4 men were following them at a distance. As he looked back through the moonlight, he could clearly see the face of Inspector Javert. He gripped Cosette's hand tightly and began to weave through the confusing system of alleyways. After walking down a long lane, he came to a dead end. There was a tall building with barred windows and doors on one side, and a high wall on the other. He could climb the wall himself, but how could he bring Cosette? Then he noticed a streetlight and had an idea. He opened up the box at its base and ripped out some wires. Then he tied the wire around Cosette's waist and climbed the wall, pulling her up after him. On the other side of the wall was a tree. He lowered Cosette into the tree's branches and leapt over the wall just as the 4 men got there. Chapter 3. The Parisians. A night after the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815, a robber quietly stole money and jewelry from the bodies of dead soldiers on the battlefield. In the moonlight, he saw a hand with a gold ring on its finger. As he took the ring, the hand grabbed his jacket. He pulled the body from the pile of other dead bodies to find a French officer who was still alive. "Thank you for saving my life. What is your name?" asked the officer.
Thénardier.
Replied the robber. "I'll never forget your name," said the officer. "And you must remember mine. My name is Pontmercy." Then the robber took the man's watch and wallet and disappeared. The officer, whose name was Georges Pontmercy, had a son named Marius. Marius, whose mother had died, lived with his grandfather, a very wealthy man named Monsieur Gillenormand. But Monsieur Gillenormand hated his son-in-law Marius's father. After Georges Pontmercy recovered from his injury, Monsieur Gillenormand paid him to stay away from his son. Pontmercy accepted the offer because he wanted his son to have a good life. For years, Monsieur Gillenormand told Marius his father was a bad man. But when Marius turned 17, he learned the truth, that his father had been a brave soldier. Marius searched for his father, but by the time he found him, he had died. All Marius received from his father was a letter. To my son. My life was saved at Waterloo by a man named Monsieur Thénardier. I believe he manages a small inn in the village of Montfermeil near Paris. If you ever find this man, I want you to help him however you can. When Monsieur Gillenormand found out that Marius was visiting his father's grave, they had a big argument. Then Monsieur Gillenormand made Marius leave his house. For the following 3 years, Marius lived in a small room in an old building on the outskirts of Paris. Coincidentally, it was the same room that Valjean and Cosette had lived in 8 years earlier. Marius made little money, but it was enough to survive. His grandfather often tried to send him money, but he refused it. Marius hated his grandfather for the cruel way he had treated his father. Marius was a handsome young man, but he was very shy. He lived a quiet life of studying, writing, and taking daily walks. Sometimes on his walks, Marius noticed an elderly man and a young girl who always sat on the same bench in the Luxembourg Gardens. The girl was 13 or 14 and always wore the same black dress, but what Marius noticed were her lovely blue eyes. For some reason, Marius stopped going to the Luxembourg Gardens. When he returned 1 year later, they were in the same place. The only difference was that the thin girl of a year earlier had become a beautiful young woman. She had soft brown hair, smooth pale skin, deep blue eyes, and a gorgeous smile. One day as she passed, their eyes met, and he felt that his life would never be the same. He began to watch the old man and the girl every day. He followed them so much that the old man started to become suspicious of him and began coming to the gardens less frequently, sometimes without the girl. When the old man and girl stopped visiting the gardens, Marius became depressed. So he tried to find out where they lived. Finally, he learned they lived in a small house at the end of a street named Rue de l'Equestre. Marius began to follow them home and watch them through their lighted window. When he caught a glimpse of the girl, his heart began to beat faster. On the 8th night of coming to the house, The lights in the windows were out. When he saw this, he knocked on their neighbor's door and asked where they were. "They've moved out," said the neighbor. Then the neighbor slammed the door in Marius's face. Summer and fall passed, and Marius did not see the old man or the young girl whom he had fallen in love with. Depressed, he wandered the streets like a lost puppy. Without the young woman, life seemed meaningless to him. Then one day Marius found a packet of 4 letters near his room. When he read the letters, he saw that they were supposedly written by 4 different people. Yet they were all written by the same hand. They stank of cheap tobacco, and they were all asking for money. The next morning there was a knock on Marius's door. When he opened it, he saw a thin, sick-looking girl who was missing some teeth. She was his next-door neighbor's daughter. She gave him a letter from her father.
Dear neighbor, I kindly remember how you paid my rent 6 months ago. But now my wife is sick, and none of us have eaten in 4 days. Please show us your generosity and kindness one more time. Yours truly, Monsieur Jondrette.
Marius realized that the handwriting and cheap tobacco smell was the same as the letters he had found the night before. All of them were from the poor family in the next room. He had never paid attention to the Jondrettes in the months they had been his neighbors, but now he realized Monsieur Jondrette's business was writing dishonest letters that asked for money from people who he thought were wealthier than him. While Marius was reading the letter, the girl watched him. Then she moved closer to him and put her cold hand on his shoulder.
You know, Monsieur Marius, you're a very handsome boy. You never notice me, but I see you looking lonely all the time.
I think I have something of yours.
Marius said, moving away from her touch. He handed her the parcel of 4 letters that he had found.
Oh, yes, I've been looking all over for these.
Taking out one of the letters, she said,
This one's for the old man who goes to church every day. If I hurry, I'll be able to catch him on the street. He might give me enough for dinner.
Marius took a coin from his pocket and handed it to the girl.
Aha!
She cried.
That's enough money to eat for 2 days. You're an angel, Monsieur Marius.
Then she laughed, grabbed a piece of dried bread from Marius's table, and left. Marius realized that although he lived on little money, he had not known what it meant to be poor until he had become acquainted with this miserable family in the next room. As he was thinking about this desperate family, he noticed a small triangular hole in the corner of the wall that separated his room from theirs. He decided to observe them. Marius stood on a cupboard and put his eye to the hole. The Jondrette's room was filthy and foul-smelling, unlike Marius's bare, clean dwelling. The only furniture was a broken table, a chair, and 2 dirty beds. There were a few cracked plates on the table. There an old man sat smoking a pipe and writing a letter. A large woman with graying hair that was once red sat next to the fireplace, and a thin, sickly-looking girl sat on one of the beds. Marius was depressed by what he saw. Marius was going to stop looking when suddenly the girl who had come to his room bounded through the Jondrette's door.
He's coming!
She cried happily.
Who's coming?
Asked the father.
The old man who goes to church with his daughter every day. I saw them on the street and he's coming. I ran ahead to tell you. They'll be here in 2 minutes.
Good girl,
said Monsieur Jondrette.
Quickly, put out the fire.
The girl poured water on the fire while Monsieur Jondrette broke the chair with his foot. He told his younger daughter to break the window. The girl put her fist through the glass and cut her arm very badly. She ran to the bed covered in blood.
Great. The more miserable we look, the more money the kind gentleman will give us.
Then there came a knock at the door. Monsieur Jondrette opened the door, bowing almost to the floor. The old man and the young girl entered the room. Marius was in shock. It was the old man from the park. It was the young girl he had fallen in love with. The old man handed Monsieur Jondrette a package. "Here are some warm clothes and blankets for your family."
Thank you, sir. As you can see, we are without food or heat. My wife is very sick, and my daughter injured her arm at the factory where she works.
The young girl who had hurt her arm screamed with pain. The kind old man took a coin from his pocket and put it on the table. 5 francs is all I have right now. I'll come back later this evening with some more money for you. After they left, Marius tried to leave his room to follow them. He had to know where the beautiful young girl lived, but the Jondrette girl was back at his door. She came into his room.
What do you want?
He asked, annoyed with her.
You were kind to us this morning. Now I want to be kind to you.
She said in a very suggestive manner.
I want to do something for you.
Marius thought for a moment.
Do you know the address of the old man and girl who just visited your home?
She looked disappointed, but said,
No, but I can find out if you wish.
The Jondrette girl left, and Marius found himself overcome by emotion for the mysterious young girl. Then he heard Monsieur Jondrette's voice coming through the hole in the wall. He jumped back on the cupboard and listened.
Are you sure it was them?
Asked Madame Jondrette.
I'm sure I recognized both of them. It's been 8 years, but I'm sure.
Her?
Said Madame Jondrette. Her voice was filled with hatred.
You must be wrong. That child was ugly, but this girl is nice looking.
I'm telling you, she's the same one.
Said Monsieur Jondrette.
And they're going to bring us lots of money again. When that old man comes back at 6 o'clock, I'll have a gang of friends here to make sure he gives us all of his money. Or he won't leave this room walking on 2 legs.
Then Monsieur Jondrette let out an ugly laugh. Marius knew he had to save the old man and the young girl he loved. He went to the nearest police station and asked to speak to the chief. "He's away," said a policeman. "I'm the next in charge. My name is Inspector Javert. What do you want?" Marius told the inspector about Jondrette's diabolical plan. When Javert heard the address, his eyes lit up. He gave Marius a small gun. "When you hear trouble starting, shoot this out your window. I'll be nearby waiting for this signal to come in with my men." Back in his room, Marius waited nervously. On the other side of the wall, Monsieur Jondrette readied a metal bar in the fire and a long, sharp knife. He put a rope ladder out his window in case they needed to make a quick escape. At exactly 6 o'clock, the door opened, and the old man entered. He put 4 coins on the table. "That is for your rent and food. Now, what else do you need?" After a few minutes of small talk, Monsieur Jondrette called in his friends. 3 men armed with metal poles rushed into the room. The old man picked up the broken chair, ready to fight. Marius prepared to fire his pistol.
Don't you recognize me?
Monsieur Jondrette asked the old man. No, the old man replied.
My real name isn't Jondrette. It's Thénardier. Now, do you know me?
The old man trembled. Upon hearing the name Thénardier, Marius almost fell from the cupboard he was standing on. It was the name of the man who had saved his father's life. Suddenly, he could not fire the gun to call the detectives as he had planned.
8 years ago, you took Cosette away from us. She was bringing us lots of money. You're the cause of all our problems.
You're just a dirty criminal, said the old man.
You think I'm a criminal? I saved an officer's life at the Battle of Waterloo. I'm going to teach you a lesson.
The old man tried to jump out the window, but the 3 men held him down. Marius did not know what to do. Thénardier pulled out his long knife. He was preparing to kill the old man. But suddenly the door burst open and Inspector Javert appeared with 15 policemen. They began to arrest everybody in the room. Amid the confusion, the old man managed to escape out of the window. He was gone before they noticed him missing. Chapter 4. The Lovers and Revolution. Marius did not want to give evidence against Thénardier out of respect for his father's wish. Marius moved out of his room and in with his friend Enjolras. One day, Marius was sitting by a stream dreaming of his love when he heard a familiar voice. He looked up and recognized Éponine, the Thénardier's daughter.
Finally, I found you.
She said.
I've looked everywhere.
Marius said nothing to her.
You don't seem happy to see me.
She said.
But I can make you happy if I want to.
How?
I've got the address you wanted.
His heart skipped a bit. He jumped up and grabbed her hand.
Let's go at once,
he cried.
and promise you'll never tell your father the address.
That night Cosette was alone in the house Jean Valjean had bought a year before. It was a small house on a back street with a tiny wild garden. Valjean was away on business and she was playing the piano when she heard footsteps in the garden. When she took a look, the garden was empty. The following morning, Cosette found a stone lying on a nearby bench. When she picked it up, she could see an envelope that contained a small notebook filled with love poems. She read them over and enjoyed everything about the poems. She remembered the handsome young man who was always looking at her in the Luxembourg Gardens, and she knew that these poems were from him. That night Cosette put on her best dress and made her hair look beautiful. Then she went into the garden and waited. Suddenly she felt she was being watched. It was he. His body was thinner and his skin was paler than she remembered, but it was he.
Forgive me for following you for so long, but ever since that day you looked at me in the gardens, I've been lost without you,
said the young man. Cosette was so overcome by his words that she swooned and fell backward. He caught her and held her tightly in his arms.
Do you love me too?
He asked her.
Of course I do.
She said.
You know I do.
Then they kissed and sat beneath the blanket of stars overhead. During the month of May, 1832, Cosette and Marius met every day in the garden of that hidden little house. All day they would hold hands and stare into each other's eyes. Marius was beginning to think he had gone mad with happiness. On a beautiful star-filled evening, Marius found a very unhappy Cosette sitting in the garden.
What's wrong?
Marius asked.
My father says we may have to move again. He said to pack everything and be ready to go to England in a week.
Will you go with him?
Marius asked her coldly.
What else can I do?
You're going to leave me.
Oh, Marius, don't be so cruel.
She said.
You could come too.
But I'm poor.
He cried.
You need money to go to England. But I have an idea. I won't be here tomorrow.
Why not?
Cosette cried.
What are you going to do?
Don't worry. I'll be back the day after tomorrow. I'll meet you here no later than 9 p.m. I promise.
Marius's grandfather, Monsieur Gillenormand, was now 90 years old. He was very unhappy that he had not seen his grandson for years. He was too proud to admit he was wrong, but he secretly hoped his beloved grandson would return one day. It was a June evening when Monsieur Gillenormand was staring into the fire, thinking sad thoughts about Marius. Suddenly, a servant appeared and asked,
Sir, will you accept a visit from Monsieur Marius?
The old man shuddered for a moment and then in a quiet voice said, Show him in. When the young man entered, he asked, Why are you here? Have you come to apologize to me?
No, sir.
Marius said, holding back his frustration.
I've come to ask you for your blessing of my marriage.
So you're 21 and want to get married. How much money are you currently making?
Nothing.
Then the girl must have money.
I don't know.
21 with no job and no money. Your wife will have to count her change carefully when she goes to the market.
Please, grandfather. I love her so much. I beg you to bless us.
The old man gave a disgusted laugh.
Ha! Never!
Marius was depressed and exhausted. When he returned to Enjolras' apartment, Enjolras was there with some of his revolutionary friends. The group was excited because there was about to be a battle in the streets between the government soldiers and the revolutionaries. After they left, Marius took out the gun Inspector Javert had given him in February. He put it in his pocket and wandered around the streets. At 9 o'clock, he climbed into her garden, but she was not there as she had promised. There were no lights on in the house, and the windows were closed. Marius was so upset that he beat his fists on the wall. When he had no more energy left, he sat down. She was gone, he told himself. There was nothing left for him to do but die. Then he heard a voice calling his name from the street.
Monsieur Marius!
What is it?
He replied.
Monsieur Marius, your friends are waiting for you at the barricade in the Rue de Chanvrerie. They'll be fighting the soldiers soon.
When Marius looked over the wall, he saw the figure of the Thénardier's daughter Éponine running off into the shadows. The spring of 1832 found Paris in a state of revolution. When the despotic Charles X was overthrown by a peaceful revolution in 1830, King Louis-Philippe assumed the throne. The new leader failed to understand the needs and power of the poor and the concept of free speech. He often sent soldiers to attack citizens who were protesting in public. The mood of the workers and the poor was inflamed. When General Lamarque died, their dissatisfaction erupted. General Lamarque had been popular with the French people because he was a staunch supporter of democracy and Napoleon. The funeral began quietly, but when the large crowd of protesters tried to take the coffin away from the soldiers, shots were fired, and people began to die. Paris was gripped in a state of war. Enjolras and his friends were building a barricade outside a wine shop in the market district. As they worked, a tall, gray-haired stranger joined them. Some boys joined their efforts as well. One of them was Éponine, who dressed as a boy so that she would be allowed to stay and help in their struggle. When they had finished building the barricade, Enjolras and his men took a rest. There were 50 of them preparing to fight against 60,000 soldiers. The odds were against them, and they knew it. As they sat drinking their wine, Enjolras began to suspect the tall, gray-haired stranger of being a spy.
You're a police officer sent here to spy on us. Admit it.
Said Enjolras. The man tried to deny it, but eventually he admitted the truth. He was a police spy.
My name is Javert,
said the man. Enjolras took him prisoner and tied him to a post. Then he told him,
We are going to shoot you 2 minutes before the barricade falls.
As Marius neared the barricade, the soldiers attacked. Bullets whizzed everywhere. Marius saw Enjolras being attacked by a soldier. He pulled the gun from his pocket and killed the soldier. But while he was saving Enjolras, he did not see another soldier aiming a gun at him. The soldier fired, and at that moment, a boy jumped in front of the gun to save Marius. All around were the dead bodies of rebels and soldiers. After battling for some time, the soldiers took control of the top part of the barricade wall. Then everyone heard a voice say,
Get back, or I'll blow up this barrel of gunpowder and we'll all die.
It was Marius. He lowered his torch to the barrel, and all the soldiers retreated. Enjolras was overjoyed to see Marius, and they embraced. Then Marius heard a weak voice call his name. He looked down and saw Éponine, dressed in the clothing of a boy and covered in blood.
Don't worry,
he said to her.
We'll get a doctor to help you.
No, it's too late.
She said as the blood flowed from her like red wine. She put her head on his knee and asked him to kiss her forehead after she died. Marius said he would. Then she said,
I can't lie to you. I have a letter in my pocket that Cosette asked me to give you. I was going to keep it since I am so jealous of her. I am in love with you.
Then she died, and Marius kissed her forehead. He read the letter from Cosette.
My dear, we must leave this house now. We're going to number 7 Rue de l'Homme Armé tonight. In a week, we'll move to England. I hope I see you again. All of my love, Cosette, June 4th.
Marius kissed the letter. He still thought he would die on this evening of revolution, but he decided he must send her one last letter. He pulled out his notebook and wrote,
Dearest Cosette, our marriage is impossible. My grandfather has refused to give his blessing. I tried to see you, but you were gone. The situation here is very bad. I shall die tonight. I love you eternally, and my soul will always be near you. Love always, Marius.
Then he folded the letter and wrote her address on it. A small boy was passing by, and Marius told him to take the letter to the address quickly. The boy took the letter and ran off into the darkness. Jean Valjean was very upset. He and Cosette had argued for the first time ever. She had not wanted to move out of the house. Now, in their new house, they went to bed without speaking to each other. The next day, Valjean heard about the fighting in the city, but he did not care. He was happy that they would soon be in England, but then something caught his eye. In the mirror, he could see the blotter that Cosette had used to dry the ink on a letter she had written. He began to read it, and realized that she was in love with someone. Jean Valjean felt angry and betrayed that someone wanted to take away the only person he had ever loved. He knew that it must be the young man they had seen so often at the Luxembourg Gardens. He went out on the front step, his heart burning with hatred. Valjean was wondering how he could take revenge on this man when a small boy approached with a letter for Cosette. He took the letter and read it. The words, "I shall die tonight," made him happy. The man's death would solve his problem. Perhaps the man was already dead. Then Valjean realized that he would have to try to save this man for Cosette's happiness, even though he hated this man more than anyone in the world. 30 minutes later, Valjean put on his old National Guard uniform, stuffed a loaded gun in his pocket, and left for the market district of Paris. That night, 37 rebels survived behind the barricade. When they collected the dead, they found 4 National Guardsmen uniforms. These uniforms could be used as disguises for the married men in their group. The men began to argue about who would stay behind to fight, since there were 5 married men and only 4 uniforms. Each man wanted to be the one to make the sacrifice. Then a 5th National Guardsman uniform fell in front of them. It was Valjean's. "Now all 5 men can leave," he said. He joined the group behind the barricade. Shortly after, the soldiers began firing cannonballs at them. The barricade began to crumble under the attack. As the fighting began, Valjean asked Enjolras if he could be the one to execute Inspector Javert. Enjolras said,
You deserve a reward for giving us that uniform, so yes, take him in back of the alley and shoot him.
Valjean took Javert back to the alley. On a nearby pile of corpses was the dead body of Eponine. "I think I know that girl," Javert said, sadly resigned to his fate. "Now take your revenge." Valjean pulled out his gun and fired it into the air. Then he took out his knife and cut the rope binding Javert's wrists. "You are free to go," he said. "This is embarrassing," said Javert. "I'd rather you just kill me." Chapter 5. Redemption. The soldiers amassed their numbers and rushed the barricade. One by one, all of the rebels fell. Marius was shot in the shoulder and felt someone grab him. He thought he would be captured and executed by the soldiers as he lost consciousness. Enjolras swung his sword defiantly under a hail of bullets. He was the last rebel to die. Marius was not taken prisoner. After he was shot and passed out, Valjean grabbed him and pulled him into the alley behind the barricade. There seemed to be no escape from the advancing soldiers. Valjean looked all around, then he saw the answer. There on the street was a hole covered by an iron grill. Valjean lifted the grill, hoisted Marius onto his shoulders, and climbed down into the sewers of Paris. Down there it was slippery and dark. Valjean struggled to carry Marius as he trudged through the river of flowing sewage into the blackness before him. After walking for a long time, he had to take a rest. He stopped to bandage Marius's bleeding wounds. In the young man's pocket, he found a note.
I am Marius Pontmercy. My body should be taken to my grandfather, Monsieur Gillenormand's house, at 6 Rue des Filles del Cavet in the Marais.
Valjean memorized the address and continued his journey through the sewer toward the river. After many hours, he could see light at the end of the long tunnel. But when he got there, the iron gate between the sewer and their freedom was locked. Valjean let out a cry of despair. There was no way out. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Monsieur Thénardier. He had escaped from prison into the sewers. He showed Valjean a key to the locked iron gate he had stolen.
I see you've killed this man.
Said Thénardier.
I'll let you through this gate if you give me half of what you stole from his pockets.
Valjean said nothing. He reached in his pocket and gave Thénardier 30 francs.
You killed a man for this little money? What a waste,
said Thénardier as he unlocked the gate, and then he scurried off into the sewers like a rat. Valjean climbed up the riverbank to the world above. There he stopped to splash some water on Marius' face, but standing there was another man. It was Javert. The inspector had been chasing Thénardier after he had escaped from prison.
Please, help me take this man home. He's badly injured,
said Valjean. Javert looked unhappy but agreed to help him. They put Marius in a carriage and told the driver the address. At the gate of Monsieur Gillenormand's house, Valjean told Javert he could arrest him after he took the boy inside. But when Valjean returned to the waiting carriage, Inspector Javert was gone. When Monsieur Gillenormand saw Marius's lifeless body, he cried,
"He's dead, the fool! He did this to punish me!"
Then a doctor examined Marius.
He might live,
the doctor said.
The wound to his body is not serious, but there are some deep cuts on his head.
Ah, my grandson!
Monsieur Gillenormand cried with joy.
You're alive after all!
The next morning, Javert's body was found in the river. He was an unhappy man who was unable to understand the kindness and generosity of Valjean. He had committed suicide. Marius spent the next 3 months recuperating.
Grandfather,
he said one day,
I still plan to marry Cosette.
Of course, my boy,
said Monsieur Gillenormand, who had become a much kinder man since his grandson was returned to him alive.
It's all been arranged. She's just waiting for you to heal properly as the doctor ordered. I've gotten to know her and her father. I think she's a charming girl.
Marius was overjoyed. Later that day, Cosette came to visit him with her father, who had a strangely nervous smile. Their wedding was set to take place in February of the following year. The happy couple decided they would live with Monsieur Gillenormand after they were married. For Marius, there were only 2 important things to do besides preparing to be married. He wanted to find Thénardier, even though he knew the man was a terrible thief. He desperately wanted to respect his father's last wish. Secondly, he wanted to find whomever it was who saved his life on the night he was shot. He often spoke of this to Cosette and Valjean, but Valjean was always silent. The night of the wedding was wonderful. The only thing that made Cosette unhappy was that Valjean had said he felt ill and had gone home before the feast. Valjean was at home crying. He remembered the little girl he had rescued from the Thénardiers 10 years earlier. He felt very sad that he was no longer the most important man in her life. And he remembered that he was Jean Valjean, a criminal who had spent 19 years in prison and who had stolen the silverware from the kind bishop's house. Not even Cosette knew the truth about him. If she and Marius knew, he would lose their love and respect. But if he didn't tell the truth, he felt he would lose his own soul. The next day, Valjean went to talk to Marius. He told the young man everything about his past life.
"You must promise not to tell her,"
said Valjean.
I won't tell her,
said Marius.
but you shouldn't spend very much time around her anymore.
"Oh, but you must let me see her sometimes,"
begged Valjean.
"Without her, I'd have nothing to live for."
You may visit her for a short time in the evenings,
said Marius. In the evenings, Valjean would come to visit Cosette in a small room with 2 chairs and a fire. She begged him to come and live with them, but he always declined. He would not even let her call him father anymore.
"You have a husband now. You don't need a father."
But as she now called him Monsieur Jean, he gradually became a different person to her. She began to accept his visits less and less. After some time, they stopped visiting altogether. Marius felt it was good to get Valjean out of Cosette's life. In his private research on Valjean, he knew that Valjean's fortune came from a wealthy Mayor Madeleine, who had disappeared. After learning this fact, he would not let Cosette use any of the money Valjean had given her. Then one evening a servant brought Marius a letter and said the writer was waiting in the hall. The letter smelled of cheap tobacco and had some familiar handwriting. When he met the visitor, he was shocked to find Monsieur Thénardier. The terrible man was there to ask for money.
I have some interesting information to tell you about your wife's father,
said Monsieur Thénardier.
I already know about him,
said Marius.
But the man who you think is your wife's guardian is actually a murderer and a thief named Jean Valjean.
I know,
said Marius.
I'm aware that he robbed a wealthy factory owner named Mayor Madeleine, and that he executed Inspector Javert.
That is incorrect,
said Thénardier.
He didn't rob Mayor Madeleine. He was Mayor Madeleine. And he didn't kill Inspector Javert. Javert killed himself.
Thénardier showed Marius a newspaper clipping he had about the inspector's suicide.
But he did kill a young man whose body I saw him carrying through the sewer. I even have a piece of the young man's coat as proof.
Then Thénardier showed Marius the bloody scrap coat. Marius recognized it as his own.
That young man was me,
cried Marius. He suddenly realized that Valjean was the man who had saved his life. Marius gave Thénardier enough money to take his remaining daughter, Azelma, to America and start a new life. Then he ran to Cosette and told her everything.
Your father was the man who saved me. We must go to him at once.
When they knocked at Jean Valjean's door, they heard a weak voice say,
"Come in."
Father!
cried Cosette, who ran to the old man who slumped in a chair.
"So you've decided to forgive me,"
said Valjean. Marius cried tears of guilt and shame.
Oh, I am so ashamed. Valjean, why didn't you tell me that I owed you my life?
"I didn't want you to be obliged to a worthless criminal,"
said Valjean.
You're going to come and live with us,
said Marius.
This time you can't refuse,
said Cosette. But when she took his hands in hers, they were very cold.
Oh, are you ill, Father?
"No, not ill," said Valjean. "I'm dying. But to die is nothing. Not to live is terrible."
Valjean's breathing became difficult. He pointed to a nearby table.
"Cosette, I want you to have those silver candlesticks. The person who gave them to me is watching us now. I hope he is pleased. Now, Cosette, the time has come for me to tell you about your mother." Her name was Fantine. You mustn't forget it. She loved you very much and suffered greatly. Her great sorrow was as much as your great happiness is now. God balances things that way. I will leave you now, but remember to always love each other. Love is the only thing that matters in life.
Cosette and Marius knelt beside Valjean, weeping as the final breath escaped from his lips. In the light of the 2 candlesticks, they could see on his face a peaceful smile.